My name's Cloda. I am a co-director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Economics and co-organizer of this conference. So really excited to be hosting this final closing panel. Some of you may remember a few years ago, we did a panel on teaching econometrics, which I think has been one of the panels that lasted most with people, that they took away lots of takeaways. And I'm hoping that this session on teaching macroeconomics is going to have a long-term effect for many of you. You might be wondering why I'm chairing a panel on macroeconomics, as I'm a long-established applied microeconomist. Thank you, Parama, who has worked in competition and regulation policy for a very long time. But I have taught macroeconomics. So I teach MBA students economics for business. When I first joined UCL back in 2012, I was asked to design a course on money and banking. And I've also taught macro at MSc level, as well as teaching economics to physicists and chemists and engineers. So quite a bit around teaching it to people, let's say, who are professional, which sometimes means they think they know everything about the macroeconomy and certainly know why Trump is wrong, and probably these days wondering if Andy Burnham is right, but don't also have the frameworks that we're used to. So I'm very excited to hear what our panelists have to say today. We have 4 panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves so that I can give them time to pronounce their names correctly and also explain where they're dialing in from. But I've also set them a bit of a homework question. So my homework question for them was why it's important for us as a profession to be discussing what we teach in macroeconomics and how we teach macroeconomics in 2026. And this question was kind of stemmed from the work that Diane Coyle and Wendy Carlin were doing back in 2010 around sort of, is economics dead? Do people trust macroeconomics anymore? I'm wondering, has that conversation gone away, or do we need to rethink it? So I don't want to waste any more time with me, and I'm going to kick off with Diego.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this conference. My name is Diego Mendez-Carbajo, and I work as an economist for the FRED team at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. These are my opinions, and in no way do I pretend to represent those of my colleagues or the institution, either as a whole or in part. To the question of why, I think it's important for the profession to be discussing what and how to teach macroeconomics in 2026. I believe teaching and learning macroeconomics using data, surprise, surprise, is important to the profession because there is no macroeconomic debate that isn't either settled or played out without using data. This is like trying to teach swimming without getting in the water. So those are my 2 cents, and I'm going to yield my time to the next panelist.
Great, thank you. And who do I have next? Over to George.
All right, thank you for having me. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I don't know wherever everybody is. My name is George Orlov. In less than 12 hours, I can say that I'm an associate teaching professor at Cornell University. I teach, so I am a weird case here, by the way. I am an applied microeconomist, and I teach large enrollment introductory macro classes. And so for me, kind of a big thing is just observing what happens in the world. Kind of if we think about how we've been moving over the past decades, right? We moved from a world where information was mostly reliable, but difficult to obtain. We've gotten into a world where information is plentiful, and everybody with an opinion voices it on social media, on other outlets. And so information is a lot less reliable. And specifically for things like decision-making by individuals, who to vote for, how to perceive. Basically, the 2 old questions, as the joke went about Russian literature, the 2 questions being explored: what to do and who is to blame. And so we are in this peculiar world where we need to give our students a framework of how to kind of formally analyze, view the world, and to be able to separate the cases where somebody is, at least is informed and is driven by some logic and some strict kind of idea, as Diego said, by data, but rather than by just their opinion, and being able to tell one from the other.
Fantastic, and super congratulations. Really pleased for you and for all our CTL friends, because we love seeing all these promotions coming through every year. Right, over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Cloda. So I'm Paul Segal. I'm a professor of economics at the IAE Business School in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I've been teaching macroeconomics for about 25 years, although my research is primarily not on macroeconomics. It's mainly on inequality and poverty, and particularly in emerging economies. However, I've always been interested in macroeconomics, both from the teaching side, but also from the policy side. So now here in Argentina, it's quite hard not to get involved in policy questions, because we have one of the most notable, I will say, macroeconomies in the world. And so I've kind of got involved in policy debates, writing newspaper articles on those topics. And that ties in very closely with my teaching, because I guess the main point I want to make is that our teaching, I think, needs to be quite closely aligned or very strongly informed by the experiences that our students are having. So here, that means, we've had a lot of extremely high inflation for a very long time. And that's something, so 50%, 100%, 150% inflation a year is something that my students are familiar with, and they want to understand and, feel pretty annoyed about. And they want to understand what's going on in response to it. So that's quite a different experience from even in other emerging economies. Of course, anyone who takes a moment to look at it will realize that every emerging economy is different, and Argentina is different from other countries. And I think it's particularly interesting or particularly important to think about what is kind of relevant in your country or where you're teaching, for two reasons. One, because it's just, it's the questions that are important. It's important to talk about inflation of 50%, 100% in Argentina in the way that it just wouldn't be important in Europe or the US. But secondly, because it so much informs the understanding that your students have when they come to the classroom. And it's not just the facts of the economy that they feel around them, but also the discourse of what goes on around them. So here, unfortunately, our extremely right-wing president is not just extremely right-wing, but he's also a completely unreconstructed monetarist. He has this very peculiar view that you control the monetary base and that will solve all your problems. It's something that Margaret Thatcher tried in the 1980s. It turned out it didn't work. She had to give it up. Not for ideological reasons, right? She maintained her, good old-fashioned right-wing ideology all the way through, but she dropped that particular approach to managing the macroeconomy because it didn't work. And in this country, they haven't learned that lesson, or at least our president hasn't learned that lesson. So I have to deal directly with that in my classes. I had to write a newspaper article explaining the British experience, and then I use that in my teaching. So that's my key thing. What's important in your economy and the understandings that your students bring to the classroom on the basis of that and the discourse around it.
Brilliant, thank you. And I love the element of international economic history and all of that too, that don't forget things. Steffi.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm Stefania Paredes Fuentes. I'm currently the head of economic education at National Bank of Slovakia. I have to make the same statement. The views here are all my own. So why is important to be discussing what and how to teach macroeconomics in 2026, as was Cloda's question. And of course, I completely agree with what my previous colleagues have said here in the panel, particularly the link to data. And so I'm not going to talk more about this. And what Paul just said, the fact that the students need to feel close. In effect, that's what macroeconomics is. And we see macroeconomics evolving with current events. But sometimes the way the macroeconomics is taught is in a very static way. It's like, okay, forget what is happening outside there, and let me teach you some basics first. Well, actually, that shouldn't be the case. We should bring what's happening outside, because that's going to help with the student engagement. But not just that, that also is going to help that economic students to understand that this evolution is part of macroeconomics, and because of that, they need to constantly evolve their beliefs and their views and how they make decisions. For instance, if in the case they become policymakers. The other aspect that I would like to emphasize here is perhaps, we have talked less about it, is how to teach macroeconomics. And I think that that is almost as important as what to teach economics. In fact, the people who know me know that for me it's almost more important, because kind of how to teach is what helps students to actually engage with the subject and then decide to move forward. And a lot of things to say on this. So, but I'm trying to reading my notes, try to pick one point. For example, just to give you an example, if we look at the concepts that we teach, if we focus on teaching the students the basics, that the labor market is modeled as a competitive market clearing at one wage level, the students will never particularly the students who perhaps do one economics course, they will never get to higher up levels, and they are going to go into the world viewing unemployment in a very specific way, right? Thinking about, for instance, how we teach, if we our teaching is based on lecture and derive a specific model, the students are more likely to believe that macro is just this body of conclusions to memorize. While if we teach in a more problem set base, the students are going to be more likely to think that macro is a set of tools that they can then apply to any problem that they might face in macroeconomics. And that leads to what I said before, that if macroeconomics is constantly evolving, they need to learn to how apply this tool to this evolution. So I think that's what how we teach, but I stop here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steffi, and thank you to all our panelists. So as is the way with these panels and how we run our Econ 2 seminars as well, I have some questions that I've prepared as chair, but as always, and so far we have had very active chat yesterday and today, please post any questions for the panel in the chat. I will pause every so often and pick them up. And also please do feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. It's, late in the session, so less of me would always be good. So I'll keep an eye on the hand raising and on the chat as we're going along. But my first question is for George and Paul. And I should say I asked 3 or 4 colleagues at Imperial who teach macro, so I cheated by asking them what I should ask. And so thank you to them. So the first question for George and Paul is, what one topic do you think has to be on any undergraduate macroeconomics topic? So your one thing that you just think is necessary. And I'll start with you, George.
You said one, just one. Okay, no. So I had I immediately have 2 things in mind, but let's say I'll go for a big category. I'm thinking that sometimes somehow in our, and again, I'm talking from the principles introductory viewpoint. So that's kind of my thing. When I think of my students, I teach both micro and macro. So a lot of them I see in macro in the fall, and I see them in micro again in the spring semester. But one of the things which seems to oftentimes get relegated to if we make it to that point, is international trade. And I'm talking about both micro foundations of it and the macro perspectives, things of you're thinking of trade balances and balance of payments, all of these things, right? So I would say the reason why I think it's important, first of all, we do not live in isolated world, right? So, but there's a tremendous amount of misconceptions how tariffs, for example, work, and so general population, and also how it propagates up to the point where if you change them, if you change these trade policies, how the quotas work, how does it affect, how does it propagate to the bigger picture? Once you work up a pyramid towards your capstone model, whatever you're using, you're thinking of ADAS, or I teach we're using ISM-PPC model, so the Phillips curve and interest sensitivity plus monetary policy. And the amount of misconceptions seem to be present is really high. And I think that if you save it in some shape or form to the end of the semester, and maybe you don't make it there, or by the time your students, okay, let's be very realistic. we have long semesters and students do get exhausted, and they hope that maybe this last topic you teach will not be on the final exam. And I think this is kind of a thing which shows up like a lot in the news. And unfortunately, as I said, shows up a lot in social media, and what's being said is not always the way how we economists think about it, right? So that's kind of my...
Right, thank you. So I think, if anyone has been teaching economics and hasn't been talking about a man with a blackboard and tariff rates, I'd be surprised, but we actually need the students to have the economics underneath that.
Cloda, can I just do one very small addition to this? Well, kind of one of the things where also when teaching these things, we need to be very honest with our students that trade's not always rosy, and wonderful, and it doesn't always add up to, everybody wins. No, you need to talk about situations where there are losing parties in international trade, there are losing parties due to comparative advantage, etc. Industries collapse, and that's fine.
That's really important. Yeah, the reasons for and not for are really important. Paul, what do you think is the most important thing to be in a macro course?
So I'm going to kind of slightly cheat by saying sticking more than one thing under a heading, and the heading is finance. And I'm going to interpret the question as saying, we assume there's a bunch of basic stuff in there, but what is like typically left out that I wish wasn't left out? That's how I'm going to answer the question. Okay. So what is typically left out that I think should be incorporated is more finance. And by finance, I mean stuff like debt and debt flows as a big part of that. And one big reason for that is that there's still this misconception that drives me crazy every time I see it, that so many people, like the vast majority of the public and even the majority of journalists who write on these issues, seem to think that the national debt is indeed the debt of the nation, right? The national debt is a terrible name for the debt of the government. And as all of you will know, in the vast majority of cases, the vast majority of that debt is not owned to other countries, but to their own citizens. So that's a kind of key fact that's essential for any macroeconomic debate. But in order to kind of understand that, you need to get into the idea of, first of all, you need to be able to distinguish the economy separate the economy into the public sector, the private sector, and the external sector. You need to have those three actors. And so basically, you need to put it under a framework of sectoral financial balances. Now, there was a textbook produced by the Open University some years ago that I kind of sort of commented on, basically, and it was great. It was a first-year textbook, and it included really nice pictures, simple graphics explaining the sectoral financial balances, how one could be in deficit and it would be borrowing from the two other sectors and all these different, ways of doing it. So a simple version of sectoral financial balances, I think, would be really helpful, because that's the only way to then understand this key differentiation between what is the debt of the government versus what we call the net international investment position, which is the debt of the country as a whole. But then also under that heading of finance, so my cheaty bit is to add in the second finance topic, which is endogenous money, right? So we talk about that in the CORE textbook that some of us worked on. We don't have sectoral balances in there, but we do have endogenous money. And that's kind of like the hidden bit that's usually not mentioned, even when people talk about the monetary policy rule, the three equation model, not the ISLM model, but the, as George said, when we use the monetary policy rule. And there's so much kind of intuition around like lumps of money, quantities of money sitting there and then being sort of shared around or multiplied, that I think we have a lot of work to do to kind of undo that intuition, and that's endogenous money. And it doesn't need to take a lot of time, but sort of, basically explaining that it's there, I think would be very important.
Brilliant, thank you. So we have two additions, or maybe things that people are already teaching, but I think we're getting a hint from both Paul and George that these are things that maybe don't get enough attention in macro teaching. So international trade, and I guess the finance overlay in the macroeconomy, and particularly understanding the government's balance sheet, but also endogenous money. So my next question is on the other side. So maybe there are things that people are teaching in macro that we don't need to be teaching. And I'm going to ask the question to Steffi and then Diego of what topic do you think is commonly on an undergraduate macro course that could be removed or lessened in its importance? And I'm going to ask Steffi that one first.
Thank you very much. Yes. So, okay, this is, I have a number of topics, I would say, on this one. But of course, all this depends on, I always say, when you think about topics, think about the overall program. And it's not just about your modules, how your module sits in other modules, how your module sits. Do you have a second year module in macro? Students have to do that module, etc., etc. So with that caveat, let me tell you, I think 3 things that they shouldn't be in any macro module. One is the ISLM model, particularly the very basic version of ISLM. I'm really happy to see that most of the books have now updated, like let's talk even about Blanchard and Mankiw has updated a bit their model, because until a few years ago, they were still using basic ISLM. But it has changed. ISLM, and that links to what Paul was saying before, considers a financial sector built without banks, without balance sheets, where financial crises are impossible in a way by definition. So I don't think anyone should be teaching that. Then something that, and again, that links to what Paul was saying, should not be taught is the money multiplier, particularly these ideas that the banks multiply a monetary base that is given. So again, that's not how the system works. We have books now that helps you to do that. Remove ASAD as well. Thank you, Carlos. And another topic that I will remove is perfect, competitive, frictionless labor markets. Again, this is something that students, especially when they come from first years, is something that they usually are exposed. And as I said before, that's something that really models the way they think and perhaps about unemployment, and perhaps that's what we see reflected as well in a lot of news and how things are about macroeconomics are delivered. If I can say one more thing, just tell me.
One more.
Yes. If I could say what we teach differently, so it's not less of, but differently, it will be the long run, particularly solo growth model. Sometimes I love solo growth model because it's perfect, right? We can perfectly derive it. We can talk about it for ages, etc. But that's the reason why we are teaching, but not just because it's given us enough information. I think we should teach less of that, and we should teach the long run better. And that should be also incorporated, not just in a growth of GDP, but also more broader considerations as kind of inequality, redistribution, and environmental stage, which are things that in macroeconomics are not considered. So that's from me.
So huge amount in there that Steffi thinks can come out to make room for Paul and George's suggestions, hopefully. Diego, what do you think could come out or be lessened or given less prominence in undergraduate macro?
Also, on top of everything that Stefanie is cutting off, I will remove the contemporary discussion of the Phillips curve on the grounds that it does not show up in the data, at least for the United States. I am not saying that central banks do not face a short-term trade-off between pursuing price stability and maximum employment. That's why in the US, Congress has given the Federal Reserve a dual mandate. What I'm saying is that when you create a scatter plot of unemployment rates and inflation rates, you don't see what Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps found in the 1960s. So I think it's time to release students from that notion that trade-off will show up in the data and move on to other topics.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I have to say I present Phillips curve as historical empirical evidence as opposed to current. So Veronica's asked a question which connects well to what I was going to talk as well, which is moving from the content to the how we teach. So my question, which Steffi and George were going to look at, is what do you think are useful tools for teaching macroeconomics? And I guess maybe we could add Veronica's in there about whether how we teach it should evolve between intro, intermediate, advanced, in a sequence. And I guess in particular, is there anything special about macro that lends itself to particular types of activities or tools that you can think of? Steffi, do you want to kick us off on that? How?
Oh, okay, yes. So give it a series of examples. But yeah, if I start thinking again, a first year module, I will start with actually making students think. And if you can do one thing is bring more news into the classroom. It's very simple. Like, okay, so one thing I'm going to do a little bit of plug-in. A lot of my ideas are coming from like the book, of course. I have the
Teaching Macroeconomics, edited by Stefanie.
Yeah, it was edited by me, but of course the contributions come from many colleagues that have put their insights in various things of how to teach macro. So I really recommend it for that. But so for instance, one thing that my students loved usually when I was an academic was whenever I saw what happens in the Financial Times today. And of course, the first lectures, they were a bit like, oh, I don't know, never. But after that, they knew that I was constantly asking that. And of course, you can use Financial Times or other news. But what I found with the Financial Times is that they felt important because, it's like an adult's reading. So it's like, oh, okay, if I'm reading the Financial Times now, that's different, right? And bring more news into the classroom. And I think that should be done very early. That means that students can use AI in a way, but you have to think more. And I don't think AI will support too much of thinking of how I engage with this particular news and then walk backwards. So how can I fit a model, any of the models that I'm learning into this specific thing? It's a different ways that I can analyze this specific problem and what does it say about these models, etc. So moving forward, then you can start thinking about even more specific models, increasing the complexity of what you are doing. But the students start with a different way. They start thinking about it. And I think we don't do enough of their thinking very early on. We just teach them a lot of concepts, a lot of modeling, and look at the data as well. Well, rather than giving them a lot of models, do less of that. As I look at this data, let me know what you see and how we can integrate what we are seeing at the moment in the real life. And I think that's how I'll start.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think as someone teaching micro and intro micro, it can be harder to find those news stories. Yes, when you get to market power and competition, but consumer choice theory and stuff is a bit, whereas macro does seem to lend itself. And I think going back to Paul's point earlier, you can use the local news where you're teaching. So it can be what's relevant to that current economy. George, any tips and tricks on how to teach macro across the years?
I mean, so the thing is, I don't teach intermediate. I worked with people when the Active Learning Initiative project was going at Cornell. I did work with intermediate people who taught intermediate, and we did a very kind of similar idea what I'm doing in intro. I think there's a big element of your context really dictates what you can and cannot do in like efficient and at the same time engaging way, right? So my class is 370 students. So as a result, it's different from what you can do in a room with 20 or 30 students. And so my take where I have two 50-minute sessions and a lot of polling, but I'm also thinking, so meaning that let's ask substantial, difficult questions, sometimes which don't have necessarily easy answers, or something where it's not necessarily about them practicing. You learned how the multiplier works. Let's talk about what happens if we increase government expenditures by $1 billion. We don't necessarily do that, right? What I mean is something which keeps them not just awake, but also feel that they have kind of, at least in a very limited sense, in a multiple choice setting, whatever, voice their opinion, what they think, like which camp they belong to. And kind of following up on this idea of integrating AI, I think even at intro levels, I'm maybe a little bit stealing here Diego's thunder, but Fred so I teach in the US context, right? So a lot of the course is sharpened to how US conducts monetary policy, how these things work. So bringing in Fred data across the board in any opportunity and actually get them not to just show them a graph and say, talk to me about this graph. Say like, no, go find this time series. We talk about how to start with time series and kind of engage with it. And I've been thinking, so I am maybe a little bit of a late adopter, but I've been thinking a lot about how to integrate usage of AI in meaningful ways. And I bet by meaningful, I mean authentic ways, because if you kind of look at what people are writing, the employers, we should care about employability of our students, right? Employers care about, not about prompt engineering. That AI is progressively getting better and better at understanding and giving us the best things we can do. But ability to provide judgment, at least at their level of knowledge in economics, and kind of having these authentic exercises, which are however you do them, with polls for everybody, when you have ability to circulate around the room to talk about them, but kind of combining that plus data, but also showing them the cases where AI stumbles, knowing that the prompt might result in something incorrect because of how the internet weighs in on it. I brought up monetary policy for a reason. I haven't checked this in the past week, but at the start of the year, if you were to ask chat about how US runs monetary policy, it very giddily taught you all about open market operations in a very wonderful world which we were in back in 2008. And if you correctly said, how would you do this in how is it true for 2026? And then it happily started telling you, oh no, of course not. Well, let's talk about federal funds rate, IORB, etc. So, but kind of seeing them that there's limitations and they need to use judgment because you can't solely just buy into the AI, the answer is the gospel truth.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, the chat is kicking off. So I'm going to move away from my pre-prepared questions. Brace yourself, panel. But one of them's from Paul to Diego and me on what we do if we don't teach with the Phillips curve. So I'm going to share my approach, which is a bit of a privileged approach. So I have a colleague and another contact who quite senior in central banks. So the first thing I do is bring them in to explain how they look at the relationship between growth, unemployment, and inflation. So that we start with as everyone was mentioning earlier, what's the real world approach? And then we do of course talk about the Phillips curve, but I do focus mainly on the shifts in the Phillips curve and what causes them and the expectations thing, rather than the direction or the purity of the relationship. But I think for me, guest lecturers in this space are really valuable, to really explain how the people in the background, like Diego, actually think about these things. Diego, what do you do instead of Phillips curve, or what do you think the academics teaching this stuff can do instead?
You're taking me out of my prepared remarks. So what do you want to teach?
Welcome to Segal.
Between nominal and real variables. Is that the point of showing up the Phillips curve?
Shall I clarify my question?
Yeah, please do.
But basically, so what we teach, the standard way of teaching is the central bank sees that inflation is too high. It says, fine, we will raise the interest rate. Why? Because that's going to, or at least a big part of that is that's going to lead to a bit of a recession, a slowdown in the economy, and that will then lead to lower inflation. So if we don't think that mechanism is true, why is the central bank raising interest rates when it sees that inflation is too high?
I think the point of that diagram, of that stylized relationship, is that there might be a connection between nominal and real variables. So inflation, price levels, and unemployment rates. I think the argument can be made about how raising interest rates slows down the flow of credit, and that slows down consumption, and that brings down economic activity and therefore inflation. The connection with labor markets, I will leave that to Stefania's point, is way more complex than just what the Phillips curve will let us to believe.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question, and I'm going to ask this fessing up to the fact that I'm still burned by Stokey and Lucas and recursive methods in PhD macro. So Olga's question particularly appeals to me in terms of to what extent, but particularly with undergraduates, such a small proportion of whom are planning on becoming technical academic macroeconomists. So at what point should we think about what we're training them for in an intermediate macro course? And I know, George, you don't teach intermediate, but maybe you have some thoughts on that. Are we preparing them for advanced macro research, or are we preparing them for something else? Paul, I don't know if you want to kick in on that first.
Sure. And I'll follow you, Paul. I have something to say about that too.
Yeah, great, Diego. Thank you.
Great. So I think Steffi's point about using the media and being able to understand newspaper articles is really important. And so that's kind of, I sometimes say explicitly, sometimes it's implicit to my students, by the end of this course, I want you to be able to understand Martin Wolf talking about the global economy. right? So that's actually where I first learned about sectoral financial balances back in like 2010, when he wrote a series of incredibly useful articles on what's going on in the global economy. Crucially, it's if you haven't got any economics training, you probably can't understand it, but it's not very technical. It doesn't take that much to understand it. And in my opinion, that's exactly what we should be teaching. Our undergraduates really should be able to come out of their studies being able to understand and engage with something like that. Now, in terms of kind of assessments, I have the privilege of having quite small classes, but also they tend to be executives because I'm in a business school, and they like things that are very practical, hands-on. So this automatically works this approach works well with them. But specifically in terms of assessment, there are two things I'm doing at the moment that work quite well. One is because they're small classes, they can do like in-class exercises and presentations, and the idea is that what they'll do is they'll put themselves in the place of a policymaker, or better for them, an investor. And I'll give them a bunch of data on a country and say, would you invest in this country, or would you advise someone to invest in this country, and why? Or if you're a policymaker, what would your next steps be? What would you want to do on the basis of all these data? And you can then have a really nice discussion, and you can, of course, grade them on a presentation. Coming to things, to evaluations that are handed in, which is much more complicated in the day of, now with AI all over the place. I'm about to try something which I haven't tried before, which is based on the idea that we have to accept the fact that AI can now write anything for you. So writing stuff is no longer like a skill that we can really judge people on. But what AI doesn't necessarily give you is judgment and understanding. And so the crucial thing is, I think George mentioned something similar to this, right? Well, it certainly follows from George's point. What I'm giving them, and we'll see how it works, I'm giving them a question/prompt for the AI, and they're supposed to then criticize it and improve it and end up with a better response. And they're supposed to show me the entire, altogether quite a short document, but they're supposed to show me all those different steps. So the idea is hopefully they'll be exercising their judgment on the AI's response and using that judgment to make it improve. We haven't tried it yet, but we're hopeful.
Okay, so professional learners, we're not teaching them advanced macro models, but focusing on really evaluating what's in the news. But also, I think what you're describing in terms of assessment with AI is probably exactly how they would be working at work, so advising the board on something, the impact of X or Y on their company. They will probably use AI as a starting point for that too. Diego, you wanted to jump in on this question about whether anybody should be made learn Stokely and Lucas or not, or whatever way you want to frame it.
Yeah, so I just want to put in a plug for a contribution to a symposium on teaching macroeconomics that the journal that I edit, The American Economist, is publishing. This is an article from Mario Solis Garcia at Macalester College in the US. He's coming up with his own textbook on teaching macroeconomics. And the argument that he makes quite powerfully is that the gap between what is in the intermediate level course and what professionals do when they advise on monetary policy or economic issues is so large that this pretend world where, pretend that you're a central banker, pretend that you're doing this and that, it's not really serving anybody in any capacity. So he has very clear recommendations, and I'm not going to try to explain here about how to close that gap or how to address that situation. And to the point of using AI for teaching, I was just gonna overstress what Paul said. Any prompt that we give the students, that any assessment based on synthesizing information or answering a concrete prompt are out. If you can state it in a sentence or in a paragraph, you can copy paste, put that in an AI bot, and you get an answer. So I believe the skills that we should be assessing are inquiry, intellectual curiosity, and idea management. So to Paul's prompt, I will ask students to design a dashboard, use AI to design a dashboard of macroeconomic indicators that will inform whatever topic that they're interested in, and deliver a presentation of the final product, understanding that they should be ready to defend the choices that they make and answer pointed questions about them. So the final product is not a document that they forward to the instructor and a grade comes back, but the document that they put together, the presentation that they deliver, is the basis for the grade that they're going to receive, because they will have answer questions on it.
Excellent, thank you. Steffi or George, you want to say anything about this point about how advanced we should be teaching models to undergraduates or to anyone?
So I would say, like, we should provide, I mean, echo a lot of what people say. Less on the kind of, we should not be telling people to pretend you are. I think, like, when you design things in a good way, like, one of the part of learning is being in there. So I guess if you just give a question and say, pretend you are the central banker and answer this question, well, that's lazy and that shouldn't be done. But creating scenarios in which the students have to play different parts, I think that's very important for kind of engaging and learning. So that's a good aspect. But other than that, I think I agree with more of the things they have said. But I do think that we should teach some basis on modeling and almost to enthuse students into kind of going into further studies. I think I would say that. But then after that, it should be the further studies who do it, because we know that the majority, I remember the statistic being 95% many years ago. I don't know whether this has changed, but 95% of the students will not do further studies. Will not do PhDs, etc. So we should teach for those 95% that they are going to become government policymakers, work in governments, in companies, and make important decisions in this case. So that's.
Yeah, and there's always room for electives on these things if people are really keen, I guess. That's the thing. I'm going to move to Regvir's question. And so this is more on, I guess, macroeconometrics or the empirical side of econometrics. And George, I might kick off with you. So people are talking about data, and I guess Diego's point about building the dashboards and the indicators and stuff. But actually, if you want people to do analysis with their data and anything causal or anything else, have you got views on whether the econometrics that they learn is integrated well enough with macroeconomics, or something needs to happen in the macroeconomics teaching?
So I think if we have advanced electives, right, especially, so when I'm thinking about like intermediate and kind of writing on a little bit of coattails of what Stefania said, they should know, maybe in intermediate they learn some foundational models, because part of what they're learning is how models are constructed, and maybe we should be a little bit like more actively saying these models have flaws. But then I think about what I teach, applied econometrics as a part of what I do. And if you kind of go, this is a core course in our program. A lot of the students I had a class of 136 students this past spring semester. And there's only so much you can teach of the foundational skills, right? I do not make it to time series analysis, because that has to be probably separately, like a separate econometrics class. But I think even better, we can think about all your ARIMA, ARMA, finance, and time series related analysis, like macro time series related analysis. A lot of these techniques can come in an advanced macro class, right? Which then puts together combination of modeling. And if you really thought that, Bellman equations are the bee's knees, maybe it should go there. But also kind of putting this technical skill, expecting them to be able to use R or Stata or Python, or whatever your department uses as its core software for quantitative analysis, and putting it together and kind of saying, okay, now you have a theoretical knowledge. Now you have some econometrics knowledge. Let's put this together. I think that's kind of my takeaway, because I think I've gotten a lot of exciting, as undergrad, I specialized in econometrics because we had these specializations, but it was exciting to get to something like quantitative finance and suddenly see how all of this came together. And this was like, okay, here's a dab of the finance stuff, here's a dash of macro stuff, which was nice.
Yeah. I think it's a good question about the integration across different aspects of any of the degrees that students. So I, with Maria, who's here, run our final project module. And I think most of the students end up doing either finance stuff or micro stuff. And I think maybe if they saw a bit more in their macro, how they can do data analysis in macroeconomics, they might explore more of those topics as well. Anyone else got any thoughts on this kind of data analysis yet, Steffi?
I am going to be very honest, and I would like to see more students using Excel. I would like to see more students going back to basics and know how to do a histogram, on how to kind of plot the correlation between two variables and explain why that is important. I would like to see more of that, because what I used to see at the dissertations was that the students will do an econometric series at random regressions, and then I say, yep, and this is statistically significant. Yeah, it's 0.005. So what does it mean it's statistically significant? And did you check on the data? Did you plot these two things? And all these kind of things. So, and in fact, something that I have noticed, a lot of the students now that come out, like younger, come out of university without knowing how to use Excel. And for all the fancy things that we do with data is not that used anymore in many by employers, because you have to pay, you have R and you have Python now. And so, but Excel is used every day, even if it's just to simply know how to open it. To see students not knowing how to filter, not knowing how to make very basic diagrams, I think that is really worrying in a way. So I think I will go even further back into kind of, hey, plot unemployment and inflation and let me know if you find any sort of correlation between those two.
Yeah.
But let me disagree with that. I mean, if you can ask that to students, the students can ask that to AI. I mean, if you've seen how Copilot works within the suite of Microsoft products, you can have natural language prompts with an Excel spreadsheet that bypass the need to know what formulas are and what formulas need to be applied. So
I'm happy with that. I'm really happy with the students asking Copilot the formula to apply, but I want them to kind of be able then to kind of explain me the basic kind of, this is what I'm doing. And that's not what I'm seeing. I'm not seeing students being able to, use the basics.
I think the basics are from what George was saying. I mean, that's where the face-to-face organized, cohesive curriculum on empirical economics comes in. So let's understand what the difference between correlation and causation. Let's get the basics of what probability, a degree of confidence. And once you get those pieces, the solid pieces in place, then, okay, I think I will just say, I mean, the AI technology is going to allow the students, future economists, to go where they need to be for specific problems. So the ARIMA, the ARMA estimations that George was describing, the AI will tell you, okay, for this kind of problem, for this kind of data, these are the techniques that you need to use. So I think we're moving again into...
Well, I certainly want somebody to be able to eyeball whatever the AI comes up with and interpret it. And that remains the skill, I guess. I'm going to move on to a question we've had about geopolitics and the moral economy. And Paul, you did mention you're interested in inequality. So I might throw in my question about whether we should be doing more about the distributional impact of policies in macro as well. So I don't know if you want to kick off any thoughts on...
What was the geopolitical side that someone put in?
So the question was, should we be teaching more about geopolitics and the moral economy in macroeconomics? And I guess I had a prior question about distributional effects, so they're kind of related.
Yeah, so I do think macroeconomics is one of those things where people can often get very heated about it, but the kind of moral fundament or the moral reasoning behind that is very rarely explicit. When I had a variable rate mortgage in the UK, the interest rate hit me very directly, and I, got in a lot of trouble when Liz Truss had her was in power. But like, we don't talk about that much. It's not an explicit topic that we talk about, and I think on the one hand, obviously it matters in its own right, but on the other hand, it matters hugely to people's support for various policies. And that's something that you have to take account, and you have to take account of democratic decision making and how people feel about what the government's doing. Now, on the side of fiscal policy, it's very obvious that there's a big impact. To be fair, when we teach macroeconomics, we talk about like aggregate spending and aggregate taxation more than the micro side, because the micro side can have a huge, just a quick little statistic for everyone. Fiscal policy in European countries tends to reduce the Gini coefficient relative to market income by about 20 Gini points. Whereas in Latin America, it's more like 2, 3, 4 Gini points. And on the one hand, it's because they have, smaller governments in Latin America. But even here in Argentina, we have a similar overall government tax take, but still we reduce the Gini coefficient by something like, it's hard to measure precisely, but 4 or 5 points. So it's much, much smaller than in European countries. And that makes a very big difference. And that also is, on average, basically if you increase government spending to a first approximation, that's going to reduce inequality. Unless you do it in a particularly unusual way. But in general, that's the case. So I think these things are, on the one hand, they're very important. Also, let me qualify a little bit. There are theories in economics that say that distribution has a really big impact sort of back on the macroeconomy itself. Those theories are particularly fashionable here in Argentina and more widely in Latin America because of the structuralist history that we have here, tradition. I think that can be overstated. I think that's actually not usually so strongly the case. But certainly the impact of macro on distribution is big and politically salient, and we don't talk about it very much.
Right. I'm going to push the question a bit further and see if anyone else wants to jump in. As in, do people ever feel comfortable talking about any economy where we can say something is right or wrong? From a moral perspective in macroeconomics, or do we think that's, and I'm thinking about this in the context of a lot of us teach international student groups. So, let's just take the example. I can be critical of Trump's policies, and I have had Americans in my classroom saying, I'm a strong supporter of Trump, and these are the reasons why he's doing it, which goes back to George's points about there are two sides on a lot of this. But any thoughts on that, whether we need to be cautious about commenting on geopolitics or not in the classroom? What a good question.
Shall I jump in just since I've been going on about? So, having said all of what
Argentinian president.
Yeah, no, even there, I'm a little bit careful, basically. So even if my background was in philosophy before economics, I have very strong moral views on all these things, which is why I study inequality. I have a whole, I use things like social welfare functions, which are very normative in my research. But even when I'm teaching macroeconomics, I really try to avoid value judgments. I'll criticize a policy on the basis of its effectiveness, on the basis of its consistency with the data. But I kind of think, like, even if I'm a very moralistic person in lots of ways, in the macroeconomics classroom, I kind of try to keep it out. I try to keep it to a minimum.
Excellent. Steffi, were you going to jump in with something?
Very similar in a way. I was about to say, usually I present students with events, with kind of policy decisions, and this is open to interpretation. But if they want to say this is, even when I set assessments, I rarely tell there is a correct or a wrong answer. It's more like, how do you get to the answer? Which sort of reasoning you get? So if you, for whatever reason, get to the point in which you tell me that Trump's policies on international trade are correct, and you have followed like a fair reasoning or something, you're not going to get a fail mark from my side. I say, okay, this is how you got there. Perhaps I would like to see more thought about A, B, and C here. However, I can see how you got there and which economic concepts you apply. And when I'm teaching, I try to do the same. I say, okay, this is the problem. Brexit for me was like, I was in the middle of teaching in the UK. And of course, we have an international cohort, but it was about Brexit. And I use Brexit every single day. My preparation for lectures in macroeconomics were incredible because I said, oh, what is it in the Financial Times, in the Guardian, in the BBC today? Okay, let's go. That's great. But all this was done from our perspective that we were analyzing what was happening, and we will look at different economic concepts, economic ideas, and how we can interpret and make sense of that all together.
I guess it is a good point about bringing in the news, though. So you do have to be careful what news you're using and whether there's biases in that, which is where, I used to ask students to bring their news in, if that makes sense. So occasionally I did get what was on TikTok today. Which is fine because that's also educational to understand where they're learning from. George?
So in principles, especially, right? Because I have, first of all, I have diversity of students and backgrounds. They're not, most of them are not going to be econ majors. One of the things I outline, and I'm especially like, I very strongly early on talk about normative and positive statements in economics, because I remember this was wonderfully played into a student coming in and saying, well, if we have very technical models, right, and we know that we can apply them to data, why is there so much political argument about policy, etc.? I said, like, well, because you're conflating normative and positive statements, right? The argument is on the normative side sometimes. Not always, like it can be different models produce different results, right? But one of the things I tell them, and I have a very kind of strong stance on this, I say, I'm human. I have opinions. I don't bring my opinions into the classroom. I'm here to tell you how to think like an economist, as an economist, but not what to think, because that you can, you have your own sources. Just be sure that you're doing your due diligence on whatever sources you're checking. So,
Yeah.
and an important part for me, right, is, as I said, diversity of students means that I also don't want to have students who feel somehow attacked or marginalized within the classroom. And it's important to me.
Yeah, and I don't think this is an economics specific question. I know people who teach health economics, but in the School of Public Health, and there's all sorts of areas where you may be talking about not like super sensitive things, but things where you can divide the crowd. And I think, generally as academics, we think balance is important. We think evidence base is important. And that's really what we want to look at. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Please keep posting any questions. But as it's gone a little quiet, I'm going to, we've had a lot of AI over the last 48 hours. So let's just keep it AI a little bit. And well, my first question is more around, and Diego, maybe I'll ask you this, the extent to which macro researchers in central banks, but also academics, are thinking about the impact of AI on the economy, and therefore whether we should be teaching more, what impact is it actually having on productivity, on the labor markets and those things. Should we be already bringing that more into our macro teaching? And is there enough to bring in? Yeah.
Of course, as a topic, but there's no answer to it yet. It's not clear if it's productivity boosting or labor decreasing technology at this point. It's not clear if it's increasing productivity at the higher levels of skill in an organization, or it is going to allow the entry-level workers to move up in the responsibilities. So as a topic, as technology impacting labor markets and productivity, for sure, but there's not an answer to this question yet.
Which might in itself be helpful for students to understand, I guess. Anyone have any other thoughts?
It's an open question, right? I mean, could be more exciting to talk to study than a question that doesn't have a finite answer. It's not a yes or no, right or wrong. You replicate what you heard in class, therefore you get the high marks and then you move on. I mean, isn't that the nature of learning?
Yeah, brilliant. Anyone got any other thoughts on that? Yeah, George?
So one of the things I've been thinking about, and I brought it up very tangentially last year, but now that I'm preparing to teach in the fall, I want to dig into a little bit different and looking at articles about this, because there's also different approaches about how different countries view integrating AI with their workforce or not integrating. And by that, I mean, right, we talk a lot about capital labor, complementarity, or substitution. And we're still in the world of capital labor complementarity or substitution. And from what I read, again, tangentially, this is like, check your sources, don't cite me. For example, I think Norway, Scandinavia generally is approaching and saying, well, how can we be on the complementarity of labor and capital here with AI? And the question is, so how does that side of experiment go versus let's have AI be a substitute for some labor? And I think it's important because we talk about this to students, even in intro, and we talk about how a lot of the capital labor substitution led to really, really great results in the Industrial Revolution, but we need to balance that with.
But also over time, and there's always, as
Oh, yeah.
You know, we mentioned earlier there are winners and losers in these transition periods, and I think we have to.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was being a little bit cheeky about it. Sorry.
Indeed, that's all right. So I see Freed has a question around, you know, as instructors using AI to help you create materials. Anyone got any experience of doing that? So, you know, macro case studies are not easily found in Harvard case study libraries and other things, or generally, I guess, teaching with case studies. Yeah, Paul?
So this idea of giving the AI prompt that the students then criticize, etc. Guess where I got that idea from?
Was it a Cloda or a
Chat, right?
ChatGPT or?
I just described the problem to chat. I want an AI-proof evaluation for our students to hand something in, and it came up with that. It came up with a list of 6 actually, and that was its favorite one, and also my favorite of the 6 that it gave me. So I mean I use it all the time for absolutely everything, and for looking for examples for, you know, lately I've been using it even just to kind of produce up-to-date graphs for me. If I have a graph from last year and I want to add one more data point to it, I just ask it to write the Python script for me, and it runs it and produces the new figure. So for all those materials, all the teaching materials, it's incredibly useful, and really, it's time saving, but also sometimes it increases the quality of what I'm doing, because it sort of has ideas that wouldn't have occurred to
New
me.
ideas, yeah.
Yeah.
And can I just ask you while you were muted, because obviously we talk a lot about biases in AI and it being very Western focused. Do you find that you can get information relevant to Argentina, or do you have to push it a lot on that kind of thing?
So in my case, my ChatGPT, so I pay like the $20 version. I don't know what the free version would be like for this. But with that sufficiently paid for version, it knows me really well. And it knows all my work, and it knows all my interests, and it knows all my context. It knows where I work. It knows what that I work for a business school, what the profile is. It knows what Argentina's like. It knows what the president's like. It knows over the year or so that I've been using it fairly intensively. It's learned, it knows things about me my wife doesn't know about me,
It
and
probably
on
doesn't
that
want to know
basis,
about you, Paul.
it can really, it really gives me the
Yeah.
stuff I need. I don't feel any bias in that sense from where I am.
Okay, excellent.
To be clear, Paul, I mean, the way the companies have changed the pricing strategies, the $20 is not the sophistication of the questions that you ask, is how fast they consume the tokens that you buy. So you can ask a very simple prompt that requires a lot of computation and power, and boom, there goes your $20 a month. So just to be clear.
But also, I think I understand that chat is much more contextual than, say, Claude. Maybe Claude just became more contextual. So chat builds up all this knowledge about you that maybe some other AIs don't work in that way. So it varies, apparently.
Unless you're like me and you've turned all the settings off because you don't want it to learn about you, but that's a whole other discussion. The other side of AI is, of course, assessments and how we design assessments. Some of you already touched on this. Paul has this nice example. But in my memory of macro was always writing essays. Have we moved on? Have people got any other innovations that they've tried or they've seen people trying in this space? I guess other than exams, so non-exam assessments. Put your hand up if you have any thoughts. Yeah, Steffi?
I have a lot of thoughts on assessments, you know that. So I don't think assessments are fit for purpose. I mean, I have been, even before AI, that my concern has been like, we are not really assessing students properly. Like we just particularly, I mean, it really depends. You are going to tell me that, of course, the people here are the ones usually doing an amazing job in doing great things with their students. But the typical university, at least in the UK at the time, was you have an exam, 80% exam at the end of the macroeconomics. And that was it. It has changed slightly, especially COVID helped a lot with it. But now we are with AI, and now we are trying to move back to, hey, we need to do a final year, a 3-hour final year exam, because that's the only way that we can check what the students do. And I think we need to rethink about what are assessments for. What are we assessing students? Why do we need to assess students? What do we want to achieve with these assessments? And then we can start thinking about how we assess students. I think we need more than one thing. And I know that there is a discussion of over assessing or something, but we need to kind of sit down and redesign the whole assessment package that we offer within a program. Students should be able to talk about specific concepts. So we should have, and I know that large classrooms and all you want, but students should be able to talk, to communicate to different audiences. The students should be able to work in groups. The students should be able to demonstrate their capacities of how working in a group improve their outcome. It's not just kind of, hey, we put 5 essays together, we submit, and that's it. But they should actually be able to demonstrate that by working together, they actually could produce a better outcome than what they initially had. They should be able to kind of have a longer assessments in which they might start with something basic and they get feedback and they can build up on that. And by doing this, there is, of course, AI is going to be used in a lot of these stages, but you get to talk to the student, you get to know the students more, and you get to see what the students actually can do or not. Of course, I'm not saying some of it is going to be very difficult given large classrooms, but I think it's not impossible, and perhaps we need to move from assessing individual modules and thinking about how we assess more overall student knowledge in economics, for instance.
Excellent. Diego, any thoughts on assessment using data sets or what we could do around that? I liked your dashboard idea, but building on that?
Yeah, I think that resonates with the idea that you brought up earlier about case studies. When you go to graduate education at the MBA level, you have to present your findings and argue how you came to those answers and defend your choices. It's not a text, it's not a written exam where your answers are codified, and if they match an answer key, you get the right marks. So that's in that spirit, you work with the technology to find data that will speak to the arguments that you want to make. You make sure that you're able to explain or answer questions of why do you select that data? What does that data represent? And I think that will make for a very fruitful marriage between data and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I really like that actually, the probing on the what you're doing and why. So the process almost as much as the output that you're looking at. George or Paul, any thoughts on assessments in macro?
I mean, so there's kind of an element, right, where I've come from. Part of my early work was on making assessments for economics, right? But like in terms of, again, so it's tricky. So I can speak to large classrooms, right? I can speak with difficulty. So part of it is how we administer them, unfortunately, because so I've been paper and pen kind of pencil. Only optimist writes in pen, but pen and paper assessments, right? Which are multiple choice with also short answer components. So worst case scenario, if somebody managed to sneak in something like sneak out and get a double second cell phone, like I'm not particularly worried about cheating. It occurs. I'm not naive, right? But crunching through two sides of it, right? One is, can you select the right answer out of these and making questions interesting, right? So part of it, which is a lot of time consuming stuff, is write questions yourself. Don't do test banks. Yes, you can maybe have Cloda or chat help you, whichever way you choose it, but base it on your own style. Because I know at least one of my joys was that few years ago, yes, models gotten much better. One of my students said, well, I fed your test into chat and it got a lot of things wrong. Probably newer models don't. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize, one of it is administering them, but also there's a lot of things I'm really curious about where research goes in terms of saying, well, how do we think about what matters, what represents our students' effort and learning? So I have a significant, and 15% of my the grades for my students, which I can do because I have a lot of control over what goes into the grade, right? So is homework and that 5% is participation, but the homework, a chunk of it is on completion. And I am not worried about students wanting to go and try to feed things into AI for completion purposes, right? This is a place where they potentially feel less threatened that they have to get everything right. That's why I like a lot of these computer adjusted tests, which basically just goes, you got this answer to this question wrong. You got another answer to this question wrong. Guess what? From the same topic, we're going to keep asking you these questions until you get it right. But it's very difficult for a student without that background knowledge to immediately pull out, oh, I need to go and ask kind of chat about this thing or something like that. And also just how do we the thing we have to think about is low stakes versus high stakes assessments.
Yep.
Route. Like we don't have definitive. I don't think in all of our pedagogy research, we don't have definitive answers. So we just
I think we're still learning for sure on this space and doing that. Paul, any thoughts on assessment?
I mean, not much beyond what I've already said, except I guess I do like George's idea, and I've used it before, kind of, small, kind of multiple choice questions with very short answers in the classroom. So it's not a big 3-hour exam, but it is, they're present, so they can't, it's very hard for them to use AI, but that can only be a small part of an assessment probably. And the more personalized it can get, as has been discussed, the better. But there's a pretty hard constraint when you have large classes. I mean, to some extent, I can do that with my relatively small classes, but if I had 136 students, whatever that George said, I certainly wouldn't be trying to speak to them each individually. I mean, I suppose, arguably, on the other hand, actually, now that I say that, I mean, potentially, how long is anyone going to spend marking an essay? I don't want people to confess that right now, but maybe however many minutes that is, maybe be better to use those minutes to see the student face to face. I mean, that is one option as well.
Yeah, and that is part of the discussion. I fully appreciate the large cohort problem that many of us have, but starting to think about whether we do things in seminars or tutorials and whether our TAs can support that, but also, if you spend a week marking exams, could you use that time on 15-minute discussions or, maybe with a quiz and afterwards you get them to explain their choices or something like that. But it's kind of, that maybe we may all be becoming Italian viva voces or something at this point, I think. Steffi, we have a follow-on question for you from Veronica you had a nice long list of all the competencies we should be assessing and giving them opportunities to, but I guess going back to your Warwick or Southampton days, any concrete example of things that you did to try and assess and develop those skills?
I do. It's a bit convoluted and long to explain, though, so try to be very brief. So I did was more or less a 200 student module. I set up 2 working groups. They have the same group allocated since the beginning, and they have various activities, very low stakes. So that links to what George was saying, that is the important difference between low stakes. So some of them were super low stakes that I didn't even mark. As long as they submitted, I was happy and they will get 100%. But that helped them to kind of work in the same group over the course. And at the end, they have to submit a project for which I gave initial feedback. So we have a few meetings and then they submitted the project. So and these small activities were a series of, they could choose between some news report or a video or a podcast. So there was a bit of a choice. And so there was a bit of variety, and they got to the final project, getting to work more as a group, knowing each other. And yeah, so as I say, it's a bit convoluted, but it did work.
Very scaffolded and
yes,
opportunities to talk to you and get feedback. So quite resource intensive, I would say. But I guess when they're in groups, so your 200 becomes 35, 40 at that point.
I would say that actually it was the most effort was at designing the things. And yes, of course, then there was a time for me to meet with the small groups. But again, if we have to mark a lot of things, meeting the groups, I gave them 15 minutes. You have to bring or send me the questions in advance. We discussed it. So it wasn't an hour discussion every time. They were slotted. So it was quite, as I say, quite organized in order to kind of minimize my time.
Brilliant. Thank you. I can see we've got about 3 minutes left and our thank yous are already coming in. One question for the panel. If you were advising somebody new, so say somebody just finished their PhD, joining somewhere as an assistant, teaching macro, what would you suggest is one thing they should do to think about how to design either the content or the teaching on their course? I didn't pre-prepare this, folks, so I'll give them a second to think about that. But words of advice to someone new to teaching macroeconomics, and you can put a context on it if you want to put business school or whatever onto it. Paul.
So mine's very brief and maybe cheaty, but true. I would say use the CORE Econ textbook and website that we have worked on. It's not that I think all of it is, as it were, perfect by any means, but but there's so much material on there, and it's so kind of engaged and engaging with the students that I think it solves a lot of problems for you.
Excellent, thank you. I should point out I'm currently using the economy as a laptop stand, so I'm already using the CORE textbook and doing that. Diego, what would your words of advice be?
I will ask people to pick up the quarterly copy of the monetary policy report that the Fellow of the Market Committee puts out. And those are the topics, those are the themes, that's hot, that's the current understanding of these things. So teach that.
Excellent, thank you. Steffi?
Teach less. I think one thing is kind of look at less topics and think carefully on how you're going to teach. Usually what new people do is that they focus a lot on having the slides ready and putting a lot of content and very little thought on how the whole teaching is going to plan out, how they're going to teach, what is going to be the level of engagement, etc. So teach less and really think about how you're going to teach that before you start the module.
Excellent. True for everything, not just macro, but thank you. George?
Two things. One on the how is do not lecture. Do not just lecture, right? There's plenty of active learning techniques. Engage your students. And the other thing is just, I think this comes from principles. I think thinking of how to structure, kind of how to make sure that you have a narrative in your course. So if you're building macro, build from micro foundations up to medium macro size chunks like markets for loanable funds, etc., international trade, and build it towards a capstone model, because I think it's very gratifying, especially in principles at least, to have this final thing which you see all the little pieces go into.
Excellent. So real nice common thread across that around think about your design and find your hooks. And I think, as Paul said, if there is a textbook out there that speaks to you and does what you need, then use it. I'm in a beg, borrow, and steal frame of mind these days on things. So I come to conferences like PG Conference and C3 and all the other conferences where you'll get lots of good ideas. Okay, it is my pleasure to first of all invite everyone to hang in here. In a few minutes, we'll be moving to breakout rooms for networking. Stay as long as you like or can. And the breakout rooms will be themed around the discussions we've had today. But before we do that, I do have to close the conference with many, many thank yous. And David's going to put up a slide with the feedback survey as well. So our first thank yous are for all our chairs. So we've had Doug chairing the opening panel yesterday, Carlos, Peter, Ramin, Abdullah. So huge thank you to them. We volunteered them all on their own behalf when we were trying to do, and I think we selected very beautifully for all of them. Also, huge thank you to all our presenters. As you know, we blind select the presentations. We always have an amazing time looking through all the proposals that we get, but never 100% sure what's going to come out the other end. So it's always pleased to see it. And of course, also to all the people who did video submissions that were put onto our YouTube channel last week. So if you haven't seen them, please check them out. I have to thank Yuki and Emma, who were with us here in UCL, for their support as our student helpers. And a massive thank you to David, who I think will be very pleased to relax very soon, who has managed the whole thing from the submission organization all the way through to getting your feedback and making sure that we learn from everything that we've done. We always have a moment where we go, should we mention Teaching Conference 2028? Should we not? Of course, we're hoping to be back in 2 years. You all know that we've gone biannual. You know, online conferences are still a thing. I think we can conclude they still have a value alongside all the other many conferences that we go to and where we do value meeting each other in person. My final thank you is for Param and Doug. I'm not sure we ever expected to get ourselves into this for this long, but we continue to have fun trying to find slots to meet as three very busy people. But I think we all still fundamentally find this a really important part of our lives. So thank you all. I'm going to give you 10 seconds